Before this video starts, this video goes over the sex worker industry, which is full of a whole bunch of very sensitive issues, such as these things on screen currently. And while this video does not come to the defense of any of these things in the slightest, this is a warning that if you're affected by those things, you might want to keep that in mind. On top of that, this video will almost certainly be demonetized, so if you like this video, please be sure to subscribe and turn on the notifications, as well as share it with anyone you know who you think might like it. It's free and they might enjoy it, so there's really no downside to it. Also, feel free to support my work on Patreon, link in the description. That's not free, but it's definitely something you are allowed to do legally. Anyway, howdy everyone. So I like getting into arguments online with silly people because it's fun and it keeps me in and updated on the discourse. But recently I've been getting into arguments with SWERFs, short for sex worker exclusionary radical feminists, and how they're really not all that great. And I know that me saying that will have primed you towards being slightly antagonistic towards them from the get-go, and apparently I have to be fair and balanced, so it's important you're coming in with a clear mind to the conversation or something. So I'm going to try and be as charitable as I can to my debate opponent, for the first part of this video at least, in the spirit of good faith discussion. So sex worker exclusionary radical feminists believe, or pretend to believe, and I'm generalizing here, that there's a distinct patriarchy in society. They believe there's a very clear, distinct difference between how people raised male exist, grow up, and treat people in society, and how people raised female exist, grow up, and treat each other in society. And that difference is caused by and also helps perpetuate a system that overwhelmingly benefits men, especially in comparison to women. And they're right about that part, mostly. And as a result, they believe that a more radical change needs to be pushed for in order to abolish the many still misogynistic portions of society in the fight towards equality. But here's where it gets weird. They also believe that there are a few industries, notably the sex work industry, which are the worst offenders in this, and that they're a destructive, misogynistic hellscape of an industry. Again, not an incorrect reading, but depending on the SWERF, they believe that these industries are either an unfortunate result of, or the main cause of this aforementioned patriarchy. And as a result, they generally believe that as society progresses, sex work will, or should be, abolished as soon as possible, as it apparently only serves to please men and enforce the patriarchy. They also draw differences between paid consent and actual consent, call consensual sex work rape, and think it's inherently exploitative, which is also a thing. And a few points here. Notably that sex work is a very broad term, which includes a lot of very different people who do very different things. You have porn actors and actresses, either professional, amateur, or homemade. You have erotic dancers, strippers, escorts, street sellers, camgirls and camboys, and sellers on websites like OnlyFans, as well as their security guards, bosses, tenants, bar workers, and sometimes even their advertising sites. The whole industry isn't just people being forced to work the street or in porn studios for money by abusive, power-hungry men. Also, women's liberation movements have fought for the rights of women to finally express their sexual freedom for decades, free of misogynistic backlash and control. A lot of sex workers, notably those who produce worker-owned, amateur, or self-published porn, do find that level of freedom in being in control of their own sexual labor. And on top of that, just because your willingness to do something only exists because you're being paid, that doesn't make your involvement in it non-consensual. Take away the concept of sex, and that's literally what a job is. In a modern day society, you're paid less than what you're worth to do something that you might not enthusiastically want to do, with no control over most aspects of it, at the behest of your employer. And while leftists will point out that that is definitely exploitation, and advocate for the rights of sex workers and non-sex workers alike, it's a bit weird that SWERFs only focus on sex work in particular, a group of people comprised of disproportionately members of minority groups, as if it's the only form of exploitative labor practices in the Western world. I guess focusing your entire energy on eliminating one industry and acting as though everything elsewhere is fine makes a lot more sense if you pretend that misogyny is the only issue at play here. Sex work exclusionaryism only makes sense with an anti-intersectional worldview. And I don't want to avoid or dodge the fact that sex workers are being disproportionately exploited in their industry by human traffickers, abusive, rapey, and exploitative shitheads, predominantly because of the extent of misogynistic ideas about women's sexuality. Because, again, that is a thing that's happening. In fact, no sex work inclusive feminist has ever made that point in the history of ever. But at the same time, it's important to recognize that those things aren't inherent problems of specifically sex work. These forms of corruption are present in all job-based aspects of society, and are a product of the hellscape we live in that is the late-state capitalist patriarchy. They just manifest the most in this industry because of society-wide misogynistic views of women's sexuality. However, if instead of criminalizing the industry and shaming sex workers until they feel they can't come forward in fear of social ostracization and being arrested, SWERFs instead pushed to legalize sex work and then gave workers in the industry access to security, unions, legal protections, STD checks, rights to set their own monetary rates, and access to quality mental health benefits in case they've been affected by the rampant misogyny and abuse in the industry. Obviously with the caveat that medical and mental health institutions, as well as police institutions, are very often heavily discriminatory and considerably less understanding towards sex workers, as well as LGBT, non-white, and disabled people, groups of people who are disproportionately more likely to become sex workers, and therefore radical change within those hierarchies is also desperately needed. As well as giving police less rights to invade the privacy of workers, as well as plenty of other internal and legal processes that would help protect workers and increase their bargaining power. For example, the harm of the industry would be brought pretty much all the way down. Now, all that being said, I'm not trying to talk about sex work in place of other, undoubtedly more knowledgeable people. I'm not a sex worker, definitely not a female sex worker, and I don't want to pretend that I am. I'm just using information I've gathered from other people who know a lot more about this than I do. And if this video is your first exposure to these ideas, then that's cool, as long as I'm not the last. Check the description for more sources of people who talk about these things that are much more educated than me. However, please do not pester them and ask them to answer you, only to get mad if and when they don't. You're not entitled to their time and explanations, they're people just like you. But when it comes to SWERFs, it gets particularly frustrating, because they usually get the first bit correct. They're able to acknowledge and see the fact that the porn industry, as it stands, is a disgusting manifestation of the misogynistic society we live in. Sex workers are extremely at risk of experiencing the worst types of harassment, abuse, and assault due to the dangers of the industry they're part of. A lot of people who pay for sex work don't actually respect the, typically, women involved enough to think of them as people, and sometimes use violent porn and prostitution as ways to express dangerous fantasies. And yet, at the same time, depending on the SWERF of course, they just go out of their way to, instead of showing outward support for people in those industries, they decide to advocate against the policies that would actually help those workers, and oftentimes harass sex workers online or in real life, who aren't at fault for any of that, just for having the audacity to enjoy their jobs, for doing something so wild as, like, making money in exchange for providing goods and or services. And it almost makes it feel more demoralizing that people can see the right information, or at least parts of the right information, and yet come to the wrong conclusions from it anyway. And the only difference between sex work and other forms of work that's inherent to sex work is this aspect of sex. And the interests of SWERFs and the aims they tend to push for seem to imply that they have this weird idea of some ethereal purity of women's sexuality or something. Like it's something to be protected and kept from harm's way, even though the past century of feminist activism has been about trying to erase this notion that women's sexuality needs to be protected and controlled. And this is the ultimate hypocrisy within SWERF thought. They try to build from the feminist activism of the past century, and yet they come to a position which fundamentally opposes the very forms of freedom their ideology was built upon. There's a similar hypocrisy within TERF ideology, trans exclusionary radical feminism, where they seem to simultaneously believe that gender abolition in the face of radical gender equality is necessary, similar to feminist thought that came before them, but they also believe, or pretend to believe, in some essential ethereal essence of womanhood that transcends biological advancements and is built into our DNA, which also needs to be protected. Which is an already outdated idea which is incredibly wrong and just upholds the existence of traditional gender roles in a slightly different way, which we will talk about at a later point. But that's another video. Either way, SWERFs are the worst because they're seeing a very real problem, and instead of being useful in the fight against it, they're advocating for the only avenue of change that wouldn't actually solve the problem. It's a bit embarrassing, really, and if that's you, I strongly recommend stopping. Anyway, thanks to everyone for watching. Sorry for the audio issues in my last video, there's an elaborate explanation for that here on screen right now. I've also uploaded a fixed audio version on my second channel, link in the top right corner in case you want to watch that. But before you check that out, thanks again for watching this video. If you liked it, please like the video, comment below to let me know you liked the video, and subscribe and turn the notifications on for more videos like this one. Also, if you'd like to support the channel, please consider donating to my Patreon, as well as following my other socials, currently on screen and also in the description. It helps the channel out a lot. Either way, stay safe, stay spicy, and as always, have a good